1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Thankful to be in the service again tonight. We're glad to see each one that's here. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We'll begin reading in the first verse. I've got a card here that says, "Thanks so much." The phrase is simple and the words are few, but behind them is a lot of appreciation. Thank you for your prayers, the flowers that you sent. It is hard to tell how much we appreciate all you've done for us. Sister Gail Walters, Joey, and Phil Clark. So let's continue to pray for them as well. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. I want to begin reading in the first verse. We're going to continue our study tonight. Last time we looked at some things God hates. Tonight we're going to look at the providence of God, and it's kind of a little bit different thing to look at. I want to give you something to do as well. Through the week, when we talk about these things, I want you to think about how this applies to you. I try to do my best as I'm preaching it to put it in a way that would be applicable and how it could apply to us. But I want you to take, as you go through your week, and think about how these things apply to you. Think about just when you go back for a little bit of some of the things that we have covered. You think about the love of God. You think about the sovereignty of God. Think about how these things affect you. What does knowing the fact that God is sovereign and in complete control, what does that do for you? How does that affect you? What could be beneficial in you knowing that? When you think of the love of God and you think about God loving you, why is that important to you? Why is that something that would, how does it affect you in your life? When you think about the providence of God, God's ability to provide for you, what does that mean to you? And as you begin to look at it from that perspective, you can begin to see how that knowing God will affect you. Again, that's kind of the theme that we've been on, not intentionally. I had no intention of doing that, but yet the Lord has kind of had us in that place and in that theme. The entire Bible is given to us that we could know God. Knowing God affects us. It affects our circumstances. It affects everything about us. I was just thinking before I preached, I want to go back maybe one day when I have a little bit of time and go back through it. But it can help us in the worst circumstances. No matter how difficult things get in this life, knowing God, if you know God, you know who He is, everything will be okay and everything's going to be fine. Just because we know who God is. Probably, what's one person that you know through that's had the worst circumstances imaginable? Job. And there for a time, we know that Job and all that he went through, he never charged God foolishly because the Bible says. But there's a time in the book of Job, toward the end of the book, that you really begin to question a little bit about where Job's at mentally and how much. I don't think he's questioning God, but I think he's certainly questioning the purpose, and he's questioning what's happening to him. In other words, I don't think he's saying in his heart, God's wrong, but I think he's saying, why is God doing this? I think he's trying to understand it, and he's failing to understand. And he's failing to, you go back and you begin to read it, and you can start to see some of that in the heart of Job. And then God comes on the scene in chapter 38 and begins to give Job a list of questions. Now I want you to go back and you think about these questions that God is asking Job for a moment, and just give you some in my own words. Where were you at when I laid the foundation of the world? Where were you at when I hung the world on nothing? Where can you loose the belt or the bands of Orion? Where, do you know when the goats or the deer are to calve? What's God asking him? What's God telling him? Do you know me? In a manner of speaking, God's reminded him who He is. And that's the whole point, that God is reminding Job that He's God. And that Job is His servant. And so at the end of the book, what Job is doing in this awe and remembrance of who God is, he puts his hand over his mouth and he says, I'll shut up. I've got nothing left to say, because God has reminded him who he is. Verse 1, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 1. Moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and did all eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things were examples to the intent we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. So Paul is reminding us of a few things here, and he's using really this type in the Old Testament of how God brought the children of Israel through and out of Egypt and through the Red Sea and even through the wilderness into the land of Canaan, and how that represents for us the life and the deliverance of God and salvation, and yet the provision of God for us in our lives through the Lord Jesus Christ. Christ is that rock. He was that rock for them. He's that rock for us. Yes, they drank of a physical rock, but that rock represented God's ability to sustain them spiritually. And the same is true for us. And so it's a reminder to us of God's providence. By the way, God's providence means God's ability to provide. Providence, provision, provide. That's where the words come from. It's God's ability to provide. By the way, you think of Abraham on Mount Moriah when he went to kill Isaac, and God provided the ram, and he said the place Jehovah Jireh. Jehovah Jireh. The Lord our provider. Today, or that day rather, Abraham learned that God was the provider, something that he already knew, but he learned that maybe a little bit more. And so that he is telling us here that God is our provider. God provided for them. God gave them bread to eat. God gave them water. God has given us the similar things. And so he's telling us here that God's our provider. Now, you go on and you begin to see that what he's saying is that these things that happened to them were examples, and they were recorded so that we wouldn't make the same mistakes that they made, that we wouldn't complain, that we wouldn't commit fornication, that we wouldn't be tempted and murmur against Christ or tempt Christ, that we wouldn't murmur. Complaining is something that I often think maybe we sell a little bit short, or it doesn't seem quite so bad. God takes complaining very seriously. And often what we'll say if we're not careful is we'll say, well, we complain, but we're not complaining against God. But really all complaining is complaining against God. So follow this logically for a moment. If God is sovereign and God is in complete control and God has your best interest at heart, and the circumstance that you're in is completely controlled by God, and then you begin to complain about these circumstances that God allowed, are you not complaining about Him? Complaints are always about our circumstances. And yet God has allowed our circumstances, and God has directed our circumstances for a reason and for a cause. That's kind of where Job had gotten to. He was a bit kind of complaining a little bit about what was going on. And if anybody had a right to complain, you think about having a right. We none do. But if anybody had one, you think, well, Job, certainly. And yet look what the Lord said, and look what the Lord told him. And so complaining is something that's very serious. And so the Lord sent the snakes in here among the children of Israel. And the snakes bit some of them, and they died idolaters. He says in verse 9, he says, neither let us tempt Christ as some of them tempted and were destroyed of the serpents, those murmurs and complain. Now, I want you, there's a lot of times when you go through and you find them complaining. But notice how he says they were baptized unto Moses in the cloud in the sea. He's using this as a type of spiritual salvation. That they were saved when God brought them out of Egypt. They were baptized in the Red Sea. They were brought through the wilderness. And they were brought into that land of Canaan. But before they could go into the land of Canaan, one generation of those people died, and a new generation of those people came into control. And as you go through the book of Numbers, it would be very beneficial for you to, as you study the book of Numbers, look at the generation that dies and look at the generation that takes control. They're two complete generations. The first generation doesn't do anything but murmur and complain against God. The second generation trusts the Lord and walk in the Lord. By the way, the ones that got the serpents was the second generation. What that represents for us and what we can see is that in that is before we can get in the land of Canaan, the old man has to die. Somebody else has got to be in control. And so that's what the old generation done, and yet the new is coming on, and yet God has provided everything necessary for us to reach that place. And it's only by God's provision that that can take place. Today God provides for us, and Paul is reminding us of that. Not only did he provide for them physically, he provided for them spiritually, which you can see, and the same is true for us. And the spiritual provision is more important for us than the physical. And we need to understand that when we're looking at the providence of God. The spiritual is more important than the physical. And there are times that God will allow us to go lacking physically, that he could provide something greater for us spiritually. And that's what he was doing to some degree with Job. That's what he was doing with the children of Israel. Today he's our provider. When we recognize God, in order to see him as a provider and to recognize how wonderful of a provider, it helps our faith. It increases our faith to see God in that light. But to see him as the provider that he is, you've got to see and you've got to understand the goodness of God. And that God is good. He's ultimately, and not just ultimate, but he's good. And everything that he does is good. And everything that he allows. And that's why we have the statement in Romans 8:28 that all things work together for good, because God is sovereign and he's in control. And if God allows it, it's going to bring about good because he's good. And if he allowed it, it's going to bring good. And so if God's our provider, but God's not good, well, then his provision is going to be not so great, right? Think of a father who would provide for his family. Well, that his provision really has a lot to do with the other characteristics of him. If he's a good man at heart, and then he's probably, he'd probably be good provider. But if he's a selfish man at his heart and he's not really good, then he's probably not going to be a very good provider for his family. And the same's true for the Lord, that his provision depends upon his goodness. And so when we see God's goodness and we see God's providence, because of his goodness, it increases our faith in situations where things just don't seem to be working out. Y'all ever find yourselves in a situation where things just don't seem to be coming together? Not necessarily just physically, but I know we can all probably relate to that physically. I don't know if y'all are like me, but sometimes you sit down and you do the bills and you begin to wonder. I can think about times in the past where I've just tried to put the numbers together and it just seemed like it didn't make sense. How's this going to work out? And it's during those times that you can remind yourselves that God is the provider. And there's no sense in worrying and complaining about the situation, because at the end of the day, God's giving you what you've got. And He can provide more. He can provide less. But it's up to the Lord. I think of Psalm 37 and verse 25. David made the statement there. He said, I was young, and now I'm old. And then he said, I've never seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread. Now, why did David begin that verse that way? I was young, and now am old, I've never seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread. I think what David's trying to tell us is, I've lived a long life. I'm not young anymore. I'm an old man. I was young, and I've seen all of that time through, but now I'm an old man. And in all my years of serving the Lord, in my experience, I've never seen God's people begging. That doesn't tell us that this is because that people are, morally good at getting things. It's not what David's saying. What he's telling us is that God is a good provider for those that are His. You think of Paul. Philippians chapter 4. And he said, I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. And I have learned in whatsoever state I'm in, therewith to be content. Why? Because he's realized who his provider is. He has come to terms with the providence of God. And I don't know, I believe there are probably times where Paul enjoyed some good things even after he began to serve the Lord, but certainly before he began to serve the Lord, even before he was saved, Paul had a whole lot. Paul was a very rich man. And he had to be in order to be in the position that he was in as a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He had to have been a pretty well-off man. And in Philippians chapter 3, he makes the statement that he suffered the loss of all things. I don't think it's just talking about just his status in society. I think it's talking about literally everything. He suffered the loss. At times, you see, he's building and he's a tent maker by trade. He's making tents to make the ends meet so he can continue to preach the gospel. Times he was in prison and he had absolutely nothing. I mean, when Paul says he knew how to be abased, he knew how to be abased. But he knew who his provider was. And one thing that's wonderful about God is God knows what's ahead of us. So often when we're thinking about our provisions and we're trying to provide for ourselves as opposed to God providing for us, when we're trying to provide for ourselves, what's in our mind is, well, I've got to be prepared for the future. I've got this 10-year plan or this 20-year plan or this out in the future plan. Well, God tells us to have a one-day plan. And there's nothing wrong with putting things away and having a retirement and all of that kind of business. And I understand that. But we need to realize who the provider is. You can lay up a retirement. There was a man, I don't know who he was. He worked with my uncle. That's all I know about him. He worked for Mississippi Power. Well, as I remember, my uncle worked with him for a while. And he had worked all his life, and it was his time to retire, and he was looking forward to retirement, got him a new boat and all of this kind of stuff. And his last day of work, Mississippi Power called him and said, well, look, we got a line down, and we need you to go find it. That was his last task. And as he was walking through the woods trying to find this line, he found it when it hit him right in the chest. His last day of work. And he was supposed to retire. He didn't need that retirement. God knew it. I'm not saying he was wrong in laying it up. That's not what I'm saying is that God, he didn't know that was coming. Certainly he didn't know that. There's things in our future that we don't know what's coming, but all we can do is trust our provider. We trust him to make the provision for us, not ourselves. And when we can let go of what's here and let go of the anxiety of trying to provide for ourselves and just trust it into the care of the one who can truly provide for us, it gives us a liberty and a relief. And that's what Christ has come to do. It's to bring us that's life. That liberty and that relief and worry from the worry of trying to make our own and to provide for ourselves. One of the most wonderful things that it took me a long time to figure out, you read the Gospels and some of the statements that Jesus made, you got to kind of equate them and tie them in with other things in the Bible and make sure it all fits together. And one of the things that Jesus says that you ask and ye shall receive. And there's truth there. It's the truth. If you ask of God, that you shall receive. He goes on to talk about how that the Lord would give good gifts and know how to give good gifts for his children. What's wonderful is you can ask for one thing and God give you something else completely because he knew it would be better for you than you knew for yourself. Because God knows us. And he knows our hearts. You look back at how God has provided for the children of Israel in the wilderness, and you think of, there was a time God, of course, he provided them water, he provided them food, and they began to move through the wilderness. They have this water, this rock, they have manna that would rain from heaven every morning. They had this, of course, except on the seventh morning. And then they have this provision of the Lord that's been made for them. And somewhere along the way, they begin to look back and remember some of that food. And that's sometimes we find ourselves, human nature there, where we're never completely content with what we've got. The only contentment, satisfaction that we can find in this life is in Christ. And so don't expect to find and to get to a place where you've got everything that you need and get content. You're not going to do it. Don't think that if you finally get to that number and you've got $7 million put up in a retirement that you're going to be content there, because you're not. You're going to want 8. And then you'll want 9. It'll keep going. But you find contentment when you find Christ. And you find him as the provider. And you let him worry about tomorrow. And you let him take care of that. I'm not saying be an unwise steward with your money. There's a balance, and we've got to find it. There's a moderation, and we've got to find it. It means to make sure that we're not being consider the ant, the sluggard. As the proverb would say, we've got to get out and work, and we've got to do our due diligence in trying to take care and those things. But to remember that Christ is our provider, and at the end of the day, he's going to give us what we need. So often what we're concerned about is financially. Think of the decisions and the things that we make that are all based about financially. Financial things. Exodus chapter 11. The children of Israel are preparing to leave Egypt. And God is telling them about the plague of the firstborn is fixing to happen. And he's about to institute the Passover, but he gives them some direction, and he tells them, of course, how to eat it and all of that kind of stuff. But he tells them to go to their neighbors. Go to these Egyptian people and borrow from them. Borrow everything that they can borrow from them. And what God is doing is he's going to provide for them financially from Egypt. And so he takes all of the treasures of Egypt and strips it from the Egyptians and gives it to the children of Israel. And the Bible tells us that as these people went and asked of the Egyptians for these things, that God gave them favor in the eyes of the Egyptians, and that because of this favor, the Egyptians were willing to give all of these things to them. They gave them their jewels. They gave them their gold. They gave them their earrings. And the children of Israel walk out of Egypt. I'm talking financially set. Because God had provided for them. They go on. They cross the Red Sea. They go to Mount Sinai. And they take the very things that God provided for them. And they make a golden calf and begin to worship it. If we're not very careful, we can worship the provision more than we worship the provider. We must be sure that we're worshiping the provider and that we're not worshiping the provision. That's exactly what the children of Israel were doing. Let's go on for a moment and look at the spiritual needs that God provides for us. Notice here, he continued down, he tells us,